tonight on Focal Point.
We have a very rich and we have a very diverse range of community-owned assets in Northern Ireland. And by ownership, I said, we don't just mean the title deed of buildings and the title deed of land. We mean the opportunity for communities to own and manage, perhaps in a public social partnership arrangement with public agencies, assets for the betterment of the places in which they're located.
Well, I started writing in January 2016, and that was triggered really by my late father's illness and subsequent death. So I started writing about my youth, poems that related to grief. And we were actually walking on the beach one day and my husband said to me, could you not write about something a little more positive? Look at that wee boat going out to sea and it's a lovely sunny day. So I set myself a task that I would try and write about every village on the peninsula.
Development Trust NI's Community Expo for 2018 takes place on Wednesday the 19th of September in the Duncurrent Centre in Duncurrent Avenue. The theme of this conference is Community Ownership, a Movement for Social Change. And joining me in the studio today to discuss some of this is Charlie Fisher, Programme Manager for DTNI. So Charlie, first of all, thanks very much for joining us today in the studio.
Thank you for asking me.
Just to begin then, can you tell us suppose about the conference and this issue of community ownership? Why is this a theme that you're hoping to kind of raise awareness of and raise the issue, I suppose?
Well, Development Trust NI is a network of development trusts working across Northern Ireland. We have a membership of roughly 90 organisations. And one of the key principles of membership is the acquisition of assets or asset-based community development, in which we promote the acquisition of assets to support organisations to become sustainable in the services that they provide. Essentially, that's that. The conference, if you like, a community ownership and movement for social change, is an opportunity, if you like, to showcase where our members are at in that regard, and to have that bigger conversation piece about how advanced we are about ownership in Northern Ireland, and to compare that to maybe how things have developed in England and Scotland in particular over the past number of years. By ownership, though, we considered it not just to be about bricks and mortar. We consider ownership to be about process, about participation, about participative democracy. And that's the ways and means in which citizens and citizen representative organisations, community development trusts, for example, are involved in community planning, are involved in place shaping, are involved in designing services and involved in the delivery of services.
And you mentioned there were the speakers who are coming over, the guest speakers coming over from England and Scotland. So I mean, if you like, what's the expertise that they're going to share? I suppose what's happening there maybe that's worth us here having a look at and seeing the sort of, these are maybe lessons to be learned from them?
I think, well, from Scotland, there's been a number of legislative pieces in Scotland over the past 20 years since power was devolved to the Scottish Executive. We've had land reform and a number of additions, amendments to that Act since. And then we've had a broader sort of promotion around community empowerment. What that has resulted in Scotland, in particular in a rural setting, is lots of community land buyouts from private lairds, backed by the Scottish Executive and backed by independent trusts and foundations. So I suppose there's substantial lessons to be learned from that as to how that has contributed to rural redevelopment, if you like, how that is related to, or how that has informed community empowerment, repopulation of rural areas, how that has informed the establishment of new businesses in rural areas, and what that might mean then for us in Northern Ireland as a tool, if you like, for regeneration, for development. And so our keynote speaker in that regard is Leslie Riddick, Scottish broadcaster and journalist. Leslie obviously is very familiar with Eigg in particular in the Western Isles, but has a broader sort of understanding of the trajectory of development over the past number of years, not just in Scotland, but moving into the sort of Nordic Isles as well, and considering her considered opinion is on how local democracy actually functions and whether local democracy is actually relevant and pertinent to supporting new forms of community ownership. So in some sense, it's not just about creating opportunities for communities to own and to buy out land and to buy buildings or whatever. It's about challenging the structures of democracy itself from central to local government and asking pertinent questions as to whether that's fit for purpose to allow reform and regeneration and social and economic development. So that's what Leslie will bring in that regard. I think more broadly what we're trying to draw from the Scottish experience is the recent Community Empowerment Act, which was brought before the Scottish Executive, I think in 2016 it was passed, and how that has provided communities with a new set of tools around the community right to buy, the community right to challenge, the community right to participate in planning and in development. And so we're looking forward to hearing how that has worked in the past number of years, how land reform, which was sort of the lead into that, has worked in the past 20 years, and what that might mean for us, I suppose, thinking about how it is that we take our development forward over the next number of years, should we ever get an executive back, of course, in Stormont.
And how do you think we compare here to that work that's happening across the water? I mean, is it the case maybe that we need a bit of legislation, or do you think there's other work that kind of got to the standard of what we're seeing in Scotland, for example?
Well, I think, previously, there was a time when we were quite strong in terms of working with our public agencies, and our public agencies in particular working with local communities and providing opportunities for local communities to acquire land and to redevelop that land. The Northern Ireland Housing Executive would be one clear example of that. But in recent years it seems to have sort of slowed down a little bit. There's much more regulation at play, and there's a risk aversion, if you like, within the civil service and within the executive itself, and it was up and running to actually consider how it is that we move forward on the broader concepts around community ownership. So I mean, that's work that we have yet to sort of continue to advance on. But then, having said that, outside of that, we have a very rich and we have a very diverse range of community-owned assets in Northern Ireland. And by ownership, I said, we don't just mean the title deed of buildings and the title deed of land. We mean the opportunity for communities to own and manage, perhaps in a public social partnership arrangement with public agencies, assets for the betterment of the places in which they are located. So we can go from Derry and Inner City Trust, which is quite a substantial portfolio, to more recently work that we've been involved in with Open House Festival in Bangor, who have just recently acquired the former courthouse in Bangor Town Centre. And in between that, there's a plethora of examples of buildings and land which have been acquired by local communities and redeveloped by local communities for the purposes of regeneration and meeting local needs. So we're behind the curve, maybe in terms of legislation, but we're not behind the curve in terms of having a very rich and a very diverse third sector, a development trust sector, which is very much to the fore in terms of area-based regeneration.
Given this focus that you have on the issue of social change and the role that community asset transfer and community ownership can play in that, what role do you think that then plays in, I suppose, citizenship empowerment, and I suppose getting more and more people involved? Because I imagine some people might look at an issue like community asset transfer and say, okay, a group already has to be pretty strong, pretty well organised, they need to be strong to be able to take something like this on. But do you think is the opposite true as well, where it can help actually to give groups a boost if they can take something like this on as well? I
think for us, we want to build the foundation principles around what does participation look like in a town or a village. I mean, do we have a really engaged, active citizenship that are working with local government, that are working with local government officers, that are working with public agencies, that are charged, with a statutory obligation to deliver services in those places? And if the answer to that in various parts of Northern Ireland is it's quite active, it's quite engaged, then that might be sufficient in terms of rewarding citizen participation. But I mean, our general experience is that that's really not the case, you know what I mean? So the question is, how do we begin to change that? Now, if we can have more focused conversations with the people who matter, from the private sector as well as the public sector, and thinking about, well, do we have the best model for economic development, for social development in these places, or do we need to look at refreshing that model? Then that may be the way and means in which we could take that forward in itself. But I suppose reflecting on how things have developed elsewhere across the UK and England and Scotland in particular, it's about developing a legislative basis which says citizens do have fundamental rights in terms of place shaping, in terms of shaping their neighbourhoods, and in terms of being a part of not just commissioning and designing the services that they require, but also potentially being in the mix to deliver those services as well through either the procurement process. So that's, I suppose, leads us into that space around legislation. We're very much at the early stage of that. We're bringing that question, if you like, to the third sector in Northern Ireland. We're bringing it to the public sector, we're bringing it to local government, and we're asking, do we need a rights-based framework? What do we mean by a rights-based framework? How might that play out? So it's very early stages in that regard.
And on this topic, you have been raising this issue of a community rights legislation or an act. part of that, of course, has to be about the way the government or public bodies do support communities when it comes to sort of taking on some of these challenges or taking on buildings, land, and so on. How do you see that kind of support that the communities will need that should be available to communities if they want to take on a building, take on a piece of land, whatever it happens to be?
Good question. I mean, there's the Northern Ireland Executive policy on community asset transfer. Is the foundation sort of piece, if you like, about how it is that we do this. It's the guiding framework for public bodies who are disposing of their surplus buildings, be they schools, police stations, land or whatever. That's a useful starting point, but it presents difficulties to civil servants as well, and those difficulties are exacerbated by the absence of an executive. Let's be honest about that. That's just the way it is, and it's a process. And the process can be followed from beginning to end, surplus building to, and that just sort of really wants to look at realising the capital value of the building, rather than considering ways and means in which we might facilitate communities to actually utilise that building, identify the resources that are needed to develop that building, identify the resources that are needed to develop the people, to develop the services, to be delivered within that building and to take that forward. So those are some of the gaps, I suppose. And then the wider gaps then are between those central government bodies who are potentially disposing of their assets and local government who have that wider charge around economic development in our 11 council districts. So do local government have the requisite support that they require to play a fuller role from central government in that regard? And that's a sort of an open question. Some might say yes, others might say no. I suppose the answer to that really needs to be led by local government itself. Does local government need more devolved powers to play a greater role? If they've got more devolved powers, essentially what we're asking for at the conclusion of that is that they then are actively engaged with those representative bodies in their communities to begin to think about, well, how do we work collaboratively and jointly to meet what it is that we want to do in our local neighbourhood places. For us, I mean, we now have a resource to be able to allow DT&I to take on a piece of work over the next 2 years, which we're going to soft launch, if you like, at conference. And we've called it a community rights framework. It may be a community development framework, community empowerment framework. But our pitch, if you like, is that communities, as we understand them, need a broader swathe of rights around engagement and participation. And that's not necessarily around ownership, but it's around the ownership of process. So it's how do we define the communities? Do you have the right to participate? Do you have the right to own? Do you have the right to challenge? By challenge, we mean challenge the decisions that are made by other public bodies in terms of neighbourhood planning, service delivery, service development, and so on and so forth. We take, if you like, the Localism Act in England and the Community Empowerment Act in Scotland, which are legislative pieces, as providing citizens with a suite of rights which, in theory, provides them the means to challenge those functions. And we think that's key. We think that's absent in Northern Ireland. So we look forward to sort of taking that work forward over the next 2 years, seeing what the outworkings of that is, and drafting some provisions for a community rights development framework for hopefully what we will present to a newly established executive at some point within the next 2 years.
In terms of you promoting, I suppose, this idea more generally of community ownership, I mean, is it something that, if say a public sector organisation or a department was to get rid of a surplus building, I mean, is the sort of default setting, like, to sort of maybe privatise it, hand over private? I mean, is there still work to be done maybe to sort of promote the idea of, no, this is a very viable option of community ownership, community asset transfer is an option there that should be considered, it should be given maybe a kind of priority, or it should be paid more attention than maybe it is right now? I just think there's still a challenge in getting that up there.
Absolutely. This is very much in its early stages. Like the policy, the Northern Ireland Executive's policy in community asset transfer came into effect in May 2014, so we're only really 4 years into this, so it's very, very early days. So prior to that, there was nothing which said, like, that the third sector should have a look at what's available in the public sector, or the third sector should be considered as potentially playing a role in acquiring some of the surplus public estate and reimagining and redeveloping that surplus public estate for a wider purpose. So it's new days in that regard. I think a lot of civil servants, from central government to central government agencies, are still getting to grips with this as well. The difficulty for them is other sort of they're compelled in other means to, as I've said previously, to realise the capital value of the asset, and that's really where the difficulty is. And if that's what it's about, then that's a market-based solution to surplus assets. And so, well, why would you be offering it then to the the third sector in that regard. If really all it is you require from that asset is its value, without thinking about its wider potential use and purpose in terms of meeting local needs. So but those are issues, I suppose, that are outside DTNI's control. We advocate, I suppose, for more integration, more involvement with the body that's disposing the asset, to work with the community. Should there be a community who has an interest in acquiring that asset, to find a way and a means to move it through the system and to utilise that asset. What's happening at the moment, in a couple of the examples that we're working with, one in Omagh and one in Newry, is the interested development trust there has had to buy the asset. So essentially, that's how it traditionally always worked, is the asset was declared surplus. It was offered to other public bodies. If no other public body wanted the asset, it went onto the market. The market offered what it wanted, and it was disposed. And so that's playing out at the minute in terms of the policy and asset transfer, and I'm not really sure that that's the way that it was intended. Certainly, we understand and appreciate the central government has to realise the full capital value of some of its assets in particular circumstances, but certainly not in all circumstances. But if that's the way that it needs to happen, then that's fine. If community development trusts then have the means to acquire those assets, then the issue thereafter is in how do we engage strategically with central government, with local government, to capitalise those buildings and to invest in the organisation, its capacity, its business, and the services that it wants to deliver from that asset, and that potentially then could be the game changer as well. So it works in a number of different ways. It's just not, there's a surplus building, put my hand up, say, I want that, and I'll do this. But it doesn't work like that either, you know.
Sorry, just wrap up then. For anyone who wants to find out more about the expo, or how I suppose to take part, where can they find out more?
Well, you can find out more about the expo on our website, dtni.org.uk, phoning our office, 02890 311132, and we'll give you all the information you need.
Perfect. Well, Charlie, once again, thanks very much for coming today, and good luck with all your work.
Thank you very much, Kieran.
Nestled along the coastline, home to most easterly Burr Point, her sweeping bay with sand and rocks, Mother Nature did anoint. She's the first to see the sunrise, the first to greet the day, the last to see the darkness fall with moonlight on the bay. Burial Island just off the coast, a resting place for Danes, now famed for its location and nesting terns. Their gains, safe haven from the weather, predators and more. There is so much to learn about, all around her shore.
Well, I started writing in January 2016, and that was triggered really by my father, my late father's illness and subsequent death. And it emanated really out of a situation where family struggled to talk about the situation. So I turned to pen and paper, which I hadn't actually done previously. So I started writing about my youth, and then he, within a month, passed away. And I started writing quite dark, I suppose, maybe poems that related to grief. And we were actually walking on the beach one day, and my husband said to me, could you not write about something a little more positive? Look at that wee boat going out to sea, and it's a lovely sunny day. So I set myself a task of writing about that particular situation, and then decided, because we spend every weekend on the peninsula and we both love the area so much, that I would try and write about every village on the peninsula. So that took a bit of time, although it's not that long, I suppose about 6 months, and I researched each village, looked at the history, and I suppose the poems that came out of it are really just stories in rhyme that take in a little of the local history and the local scenery. And then I added some more just about the coast, the sea, everything around the area, all the heritage. So I was involved at that time with a local committee in Ballyhalbert, and I thought, well, I'd love to support the area some way. So I decided that if I turned it into a little book, I could sell it to raise funds for the Ards Peninsula first responders, because in this area we're so far away from hospital facilities that people rely very much on that first responder service, and they need our support. Obviously it's a charity and they're not funded through the government. So I decided that would be one charity. A second charity was Bowel Cancer UK. I volunteer for them, I deliver training for them, and the reason for that is my late mother passed away due to bowel cancer when I was 16, so I decided to support them. And the third one, in any coastal community you can't ignore, is the RNLI, that really sailors, fishermen, people out on pleasure craft rely so much on the RNLI, so decided that that would be the third charity. So we launched the booklet, and the first edition sold around 300 copies, with all profits going to those three charities. And we're now on the second edition. And the second edition is being used by Friends of the Abbey up at Grey Abbey. Again, a voluntary group. They take all of the profit that when the book's sold for charity, basically to visitors to the Abbey. They operate with, I think it's the Department for Communities, but they have no items really to sell for tourism when they come in, and people are always asking them, what can we buy? Is there anything that we can have as a memento? So they decided to take on the booklet as well, and so far so good. And I've done one wee reading up there to a crowd of tourists and hope to do more.
I'll race you to shore, see who's first on land. I'll bring the rocks and take away their sand. You go first then. I'll bring up the rear. I'll gouge out their shoreline to fill them with fear. They think they can build to keep us away. We let them take comfort in the sand to play. But now and again, they need a reminder that to Mother Nature, they must be kinder.
Well, I've basically won in every village, and I suppose one of the first ones I wrote about was Ballyhalbert. I would regard it as my home village. It's where we stay every weekend, and there's so much history around here. It's the most easterly point in Ireland. Beautiful sunrises. I'm known here for taking photographs of them most weekend mornings. I'm up maybe around 5 o'clock. If I can't sleep, take a photograph of the sunrise. And the sunsets are magnificent on the other side of the loch. So one of the first ones was about Ballyhalbert, and that incorporated the history of the area, which basically there was the Royal Air Force flew out of Ballyhalbert and they were stationed here. One of the reasons that I wanted to focus on the book down here was the welcome that we've received. We moved here, and I suppose we're blow-ins, many people would call us, but we've settled very much into the community. We're here for over 8 years now. We have many friends in the area, many friends on the peninsula, and we regard it as our peninsula pause. It's where we relax, and you step back in time in many ways, because the area is so unspoilt, and perhaps that's the lack of investment too, but there are so many hidden gems here, both in terms of scenery, in terms of people, and in terms of heritage. Well, this is Ballyhalbert Harbour. It's a Victorian harbour. Again, it's due for refurbishment. There's an awful lot of refurbishment required in this area. You probably will have noticed if you're driving around the roads that some of them aren't in great condition. So an awful lot of the local people would like to see more investment, and I know that there are some plans afoot to invest and refurbish the harbour. It would have been used an awful lot more in years gone by. Still very popular with jet skiers and leisure craft owners at the weekend. We always say build it and they will come, and I know local people might think that there's not enough investment in terms of a large facility for people to gather at, but to me an awful lot of the attraction of the peninsula is the coastline. You have in the south the Wild Atlantic Way. Well, we have a beautiful Irish coastline here that is largely unappreciated in terms of its tourism potential. It's absolutely beautiful scenery. There's sandy bays, hidden coves. It's not just a boring sandy beach. There's a lovely rocky outline, which actually makes it an awful lot more interesting. And on the inside you have Strangford Lough, which is a World Heritage Site. The book is currently for sale at Grey Abbey, and it's being sold to support the Friends of the Abbey, so it's all profits go to Friends of the Abbey. It's also available on my Facebook page, Observations in Rhyme. you can contact me there and I can arrange for a copy for anyone who's interested.